This tragic story unfolded in France in 1995, where a family of 4 senselessly lost their lives. An amateur video captures a poignant snapshot of their final days. A family gathering in the garden, adults lounging on deck chairs and swimsuits while children laugh and play in the pool. The weather is perfect, and the atmosphere is filled with joy. Yet, this heartwarming scene is haunting. Just 48 hours later, the family would be nearly wiped out. On Tuesday, May 30th, 1995, Samantha Bebian, a 25-year-old wife and mother of 3 young children, sat in her apartment in the village of Saint-Andiol-Château in France's Rhône department. As the evening progressed, the phone rang at 7 p.m. When Samantha answered, the voice on the other end left her momentarily stunned. It was her parents' neighbor calling with devastating news. Her parents' house was on fire. The fire department was already on the scene, but the blaze was intense. At that moment, no one knew if anyone was inside the house. Overcome with dread, Samantha rushed to her neighbors, pleading with them to watch her children. She then jumped into her car and drove frantically toward her parents' home. Her mind raced with one overwhelming thought: her family. Her parents, Odette and Vincent Bebian, and her 2 younger siblings, 16-year-old Aileen and 21-year-old Vincent Jr., were all she could think about as she sped toward the unimaginable. Were they at home? Were they at home? These words ring incessantly in Samantha's head. The house lies just a few kilometers away, so the young woman quickly arrives at the site. Clouds of smoke can be seen in the distance. The property is full of police and fire trucks. Neighbors, gathered in a cluster, stand nearby, behind the part of the site that is secured with tape. Firefighters are still busy extinguishing the fire. The building is completely destroyed. The ground around it is even scorched. It is clear that the fire was huge. Samantha is completely devastated as she watches the roof of her family home collapse. The work of destruction is so enormous that both she and other witnesses to the drama realize one thing: whoever was in the building will not get out alive. Samantha is joined by her husband, Eric. The two helplessly watch what is happening. Several more minutes pass when a policeman approaches the couple. Samantha later said that as soon as the officer looked at her, she already knew what he would have to tell her. "We found 4 bodies," the young woman hears, after which she collapses into her husband's arms. As of now, it is still unknown what caused the fire, but everyone tentatively assumes that the cause was a gas explosion or an electrical short circuit. This theory seems to be confirmed by the testimonies of neighbors, as several of them state that around 6:45 p.m. they heard a not-so-loud explosion, and immediately afterwards the Bebian family's house went up in flames. News of the death of 4 people in the fire instantly reaches the local media, and several journalists are already on the scene. They are standing in front of cameras near the house, with clouds of smoke rising in the background. It is the reporters who are the first to report the latest news, which is causing shock throughout France. All members of the Bebian family were shot first, and the fire only broke out after their deaths. Throughout the night, services are working intensively at the scene of the tragedy. In the morning, the police have preliminary findings. All the household members were shot with small-caliber gun. The perpetrators waited for their victims inside the house for many hours during the day, as it is known that the family members returned there at completely different times. The bodies are located in various rooms on the first floor of the house. Several bullets were fired at each of the family members. After the latest murder, the rooms were doused with gasoline and set on fire to cover the tracks. Firefighters even found 2 charred gasoline canisters. Everything gives the impression of an execution, but no one has any idea who wanted to annihilate the entire family or why. Investigators already know that the Bebian family is completely ordinary. None of its members has a police record. Nothing is known about any conflicts in the neighborhood. It's a normal family, with parents who love their children and care about their upbringing and education. Also, Samantha and her husband had an excellent relationship with her relatives, which both emphasize. They met frequently, celebrated birthdays together, and saw each other on other occasions. In fact, such a joint meeting took place just 2 days before the tragedy, on Sunday, May 28th, on the occasion of Mother's Day. Everyone was sitting in the garden. The weather was great. Samantha and Eric came with their children. The toddlers played in the pool with their 16-year-old Anteline, while the event was filmed by 21-year-old Vincent. A virtually undamaged videotape with amateur film of the event will soon be discovered by the police, as the tape is one of the items found in the charred rubble. The description of the latter party, provided by its surviving participants, turns out to be 100% true. The video shows smiling family members sitting fully relaxed in the sun among the greenery. It is hard to believe that several of them will be killed 48 hours later by execution. This picture of a compliant, even idyllic family life is confirmed by neighbors, friends, and extended family members. The Lyon police are investigating. A special committee of 30 police officers is formed, and its members immediately get to work intensively. Investigators at this point are particularly troubled by the case of the dog. Odette and Vincent had a German Shepherd. The dog recognized only household members and immediate family members, while he was very distrustful of unfamiliar people. Whenever a stranger appeared near the house, the dog barked very loudly and behaved aggressively, so such a person would certainly not dare to enter the property. The German Shepherd was so threatening that when Bibian's family had guests, they had to tie him up or lock him in another room. So why didn't any of the neighbors hear the dog barking on the day the tragedy occurred? Does this mean that the dog knew the perpetrator? Police officers initially formulate the following theory. Someone in the family first shot his fellow residents and then committed suicide. Naturally, in such a case, there must be a gun or at least its burned remains at the scene. The search of the ruins is still underway, but soon investigators are sure that the weapons have not been found. The version with murders ending in suicide must therefore be rejected. When the autopsy results come in, it is already possible to determine the time of death of all the people. Based on this data and other findings to date, including officers are reconstructing the course of events of the tragic day, they are also determining that the perpetrator acted alone. Odette, who is a nurse by profession, worked at a hospital in the nearby town of Givers. On the night of May 29th to 30th, the woman had a night shift that ended at 7 a.m. After work, a friend drove Odette home. They were almost to their destination when they were passed by the car of her son-in-law Eric, who was giving Odette signs that he would stop by for coffee soon. It was a regular habit of theirs. Eric would often stop by to see his in-laws for coffee before leaving for work. So at 7:30 a.m. Odette and her husband and son-in-law sat down to their morning coffee. The meeting lasted until 7:45 a.m., when Vincent Sr., as usual at this time, had to leave for work. Shortly afterwards, he said goodbye, and so did Eric. Odette was thus left alone and most likely went to bed to sleep off the night. As a rule, she went to bed at 8:15 a.m., so it can be assumed that she was killed no earlier than that hour the murderer shot her as she slept. Around 11:30 a.m., son Vincent returned home. This is certain because one of the neighbors noticed how Vincent drove his car up to the house, climbed the stairs, and closed the front door behind him. Immediately after, Vincent Jr. was hit by 3 bullets. Between 12 p.m. and 12:30, his father came to the house. The murderer was waiting for him in the kitchen and from there fired several shots at him. Eileen's daughter was seen getting off the bus at 5 p.m. As usual. Later, one of her neighbors observed the girl enter the house. Although the woman was unable to determine the exact time of this observation, but knowing Eileen's habits in the distance from the bus stop to the house, it was easy to determine that the teenager must have arrived there at 5:30 p.m. At the latest. The bullet reached her just after she went inside and closed the door. The bang was heard by neighbors at 6:45 p.m. According to police, the murder was carefully planned and precisely executed. The perpetrator, after shooting each person, dragged the body to another room and mopped the floor so as not to frighten another person entering the house. Who could be someone with enough cold blood to not only carry out 4 executions, but to stay in the house for a total of many hours while the corpses of the murdered are in the rooms next door? Is there anyone like that in the family circle? Investigators are looking for a motive because there must have been one. They focus first on the younger members of the family. Aileen and Vincent love soccer. They are fans of the club Lampique Lyonnais and are in contact with a group of its fans called the Bad Goonies, which is known for various street brawls and even acts of violence. So could this have been about a spat between the fans of the group, while one of the aggressors decided to take revenge on the whole family? Or perhaps he had no such plans, But once he got into the house, events spun out of control. The lead seems a good one, especially since a new plot unexpectedly emerges in the ongoing case. Namely, one of the neighbors testifies that on the tragic day, a few hours before the fire broke out, a young man was hanging around outside the Bibian family's house. The woman knows him by sight. She knows that his name is Christophe and that he was a good friend of young Vincent Bibian. That day, Christophe stayed quite a while outside Vincent's house. He would stop or walk between cars standing nearby. Listening to music, it looked as if he was waiting for someone. The young man was also seen by several other witnesses. When investigators check the information on Christophe, for the first time something in the case begins to come together, for it turns out that the young man belongs to the bad guys. Neighbors also say that they saw him often on walks with the Bibian family's dog, as he took care of it when they were absent for a long time. So the dog was friendly with Christophe. This information is very important for the investigators. The man is immediately questioned. He testifies that he had an appointment with Vincent after his work, as they were supposed to go together to meet with colleagues. As agreed, he showed up at the family's house before 1 p.m. He knocked on the door, but no one opened it for him. He started tapping on the windows to no avail. He was surprised, because there was a friend's car outside the house. Christophe waited a little longer, went somewhere, returned in a while. He knocked again, also on the windows, but as before, there was no answer, so he went to the meeting alone without Vincent. The policeman asked Christophe why he didn't just try to go inside. The man says he is not in the habit of entering other people's houses uninvited, and besides, why would he do that? There was no one inside after all. Christophe answers all questions in a confident voice and without hesitation, while his explanations sound coherent. Intuition tells the investigators that the young man is telling the truth. Naturally, the same day they check the information given. Everything is confirmed, and at the same time it turns out that at 5:30 p.m. when Aileen was shot, Christophe was still at the meeting he was originally supposed to go to with Vincent, so he is not the murderer. Investigators are thus back to square one. Meanwhile, the day of the family's funeral arrives. Crowds gather in front of the church, as the nationally publicized case has attracted a lot of people from near and far. Emotions are running high for coffins carried one after another is a shocking sight. Among those attending the funeral are officers in civilian clothes, whose job is to discreetly observe the ceremony, as well as film it. The police officers have eyes and ears open, paying attention to literally everything, even the simple comments of the funeral attendees. No one yet knows that this strategy will be successful, and it will originate in mere gossip. They concern Samantha's clothing. At the funeral, the young woman is admittedly all in black, but the skirt she is wearing does not even reach her knees. Criticism is heard from various sides. People whisper that it is not decent to dress like this for the funeral of parents and siblings. There are comments that Samantha is a happy heiress. It is possible that she is pleased with the death of her loved ones or even has something to do with it. Investigators are beginning to explore this thread. Admittedly, at first they ruled out the spouse's involvement in the murders, as each of them showed their alibis. However, perhaps something was overlooked in the investigation? Either way, both Samantha and Eric would have fit the profile of the perpetrator. They belonged to the people closest to the murdered. They knew their habits. The dog treated them as its own. They could have played it out in such a way that Eric acted at the scene of the crime, while Samantha helped him with the preparations. Police officers are gathering more detailed information about the couple. Eric and Samantha became a couple when they were still teenagers. In 1987, their first child was born, 2 more followed. It seems that the marriage is happy. The police do not come across information about major conflicts or quarrels. Samantha is considered by all to be a loving daughter, while her husband had an excellent relationship with his in-laws. Many people point out that Eric Brios is very ambitious. This 27-year-old already has his own company, which produces metal entrance gates. All indications are that Eric is an ideal son-in-law, but investigators are distrustful. Rather, they get the impression that he is a careerist who wants to prove to everyone around him that he will go very far. So they dig further into his life, and indeed, there are flaws in this perfect picture. The cops learn that Eric has huge financial problems, of which, by the way, his family has no idea. Investigators also receive information that the man has had similar problems in the past. He started various companies, but each of them eventually failed. His in-laws wanted to help him, so they recently took out a large loan. With the money, Eric was to get back on his feet and expand his current company. For the time being, the spouses are repaying the amount regularly, although it seems not without difficulty. Could it be that they planned the murder of 4 people to get rid of the debt and inherit Samantha's parents' assets? The couple is asked to talk at the police station. Eric gives the impression of being confident and has an answer to every question. Again, he gives a very detailed description of what he did hour after hour on that fateful day. After visiting his in-laws, he went to the company, then home, where he had dinner with his wife and children at 1:30 p.m. At 1:30 p.m., he was back at the company and had many business meetings. By 6:30 p.m., he was already sitting in the bar, where he is a regular customer. He left the premises at 7 p.m. when he learned of the tragedy, so he is known to have an alibi for the explosion. Samantha also has an alibi over the course of almost a full day. She drove and picked up her children from school one by one and did some shopping. The couple is outraged that the police suspect them of something. Investigators dig into the case and determine that, yes, Eric was in the bar at the time of the explosion, but his alibi for the hours of the murders is very uncertain. The man claims he was in his workshop and in the office, but fails to confirm this. None of the employees saw him there. Eric did not make a call from there from his landline phone, nor did anyone call him on that phone. Spouses are becoming increasingly suspicious. On June 14th, the police decide to detain the two and interrogate them in separate rooms, of course. Investigators believe that Eric was the murderer and that his wife was his right hand. Samantha strongly denies her involvement in the murders. She defends her husband. She is sure that he also has nothing to do with the tragedy that happened to her family. Eric also does not admit to anything. However, the situation changes when the investigators show him a photo of one of the burned canisters. On the face of the interrogator, emotion can be seen for the first time. Finally, Eric confesses that he will tell what really took place. He stresses that he is not a murderer, then begins his story at 5:30 p.m. He entered his in-laws' house. No one answered the knock, and the door was open. He saw that every member of the household was dead. He was shocked. Then he thought he would set the house on fire just so his wife wouldn't get shocked at the sight of so many bodies. So he poured gasoline over everything, cut the candle into 2 equal parts, and placed one of them on the gasoline-poured floor. It was known that the candle would only constitute an ignition after melting. This in turn would take tens of minutes, while he would not draw suspicion on himself. Police officers do not believe this version, but now at least they know how Eric caused the explosion, while providing himself with an excellent alibi. Immediately after this part of the interrogation, the investigators repeat to his wife what they just heard. Samantha is devastated, and for a long time she can't even get a word out. Finally, answering the investigator's question, she says she doesn't believe the motivation given by her husband. It comes to the woman that he is the perpetrator of the 4 murders. The suspect still does not admit to murdering 4 people and creates several more different versions of what happened on May 30th. However, police believe they have enough evidence to complete their investigation and file an indictment. Eric's relatives and friends are in complete shock. How is it possible that this young man planned the murder of his wife's parents and siblings in cold blood, and calmly went home for dinner between the murders? As for the motivation, the psychiatrist expert puts forward the following thesis. The accused was not only concerned with the inheritance, he was mainly driven by pride and ambition. The goal and meaning of Eric's life was to have recognition, to impress those around him with his resourcefulness, which was naturally also to be expressed in his wealth. Since, despite a loan from his in-laws, he failed once again to realize his ambitions, Eric decided to do it differently, in the only way he thought possible. In the course of further investigation, Samantha is freed from all suspicion. The trial of Eric Bruges drags on for several years. On October 18, 1999, the man is sentenced to life imprisonment. Over the following years, Eric Bruges seeks early release from prison, but without success. He succeeds only after serving 26 years. October 25, 2021, he leaves prison. According to French media reports, the court's decision was also influenced by the convict's poor health. Eric Bruyas to this day has not admitted his guilt. A young girl left her home and vanished without a trace. The investigation quickly centered on a neighbor as the primary suspect, but the lack of concrete evidence prevented the police from making an arrest. Over the years, detectives encountered a series of shocking twists and turns, yet the case stretched on for 25 years, leaving the truth shrouded in mystery. Charmini's family had emigrated from Sri Lanka to Canada, seeking a better life in a foreign land. Charmini, a 9th grade student, was a typical teenager who enjoyed spending time with friends and having fun. Known for her brilliance as a student, she was deeply loved by her family and harbored big dreams for the future. Those who knew Charmini often described her as lively, compassionate, and always willing to help others in need. Tragically, it may have been this open and trusting nature that inadvertently led her into danger. In 1999, Charmini's life took an unfathomable turn, leaving her family and community grappling with a loss that remains unresolved to this day. The prom was coming up. Like any girl, Charmini wanted to look like a princess. Soon, Charmini happily informed her parents that she had found a part-time job as a weekend receptionist. And now she could not only save money for a dress and shoes, but also help her family. On the morning of Saturday, June 12th, Toronto was already enveloped in a heavy blanket of humidity, and the Anandaville family didn't have air conditioning in their Don Mills apartment. 15-year-old Charmini was scheduled to start a new job that morning. Her parents wanted to drive her to work, but they were called away unexpectedly to help a sick relative. They asked her to leave the number and address of her employer. She had told them it was a position answering phones just a few blocks away. But Charmini had told her close friends another story, that a police officer had offered her a $12 an hour job as an undercover drug operative. Like many families who had found refuge in Canada, the Anandaville struggled to make ends meet. Charmini's father, Eller Nayakam, had moved from Sri Lanka to Toronto in 1994 to set up a new life for his family. He was soon able to sponsor his wife, Vasantamalar, and their 3 children. Kathy's was 8, Charmini was 10, and the eldest, Dinesh, was 12. The whole family worked hard to build a new life in Toronto. One of the kids' jobs was helping their father deliver the Toronto Sun and Toronto Star. On Friday nights, the family would pick up the flyer inserts for the Saturday newspapers. They'd assemble them together, sometimes ordering pizza. Then they'd all get up early the next morning, the kids running around dropping off the papers in the pre-dawn hours. The Anandavilles managed, and the kids excelled in school. Charmini was especially bright, both in intellect and spirit. She attended Woodbine Junior High for grades 7 through 9, and her smile beams from the pages of the yearbook. Girls often find their tribe in those early teenage years, sometimes oscillating between the mean girl posse and the empathetic group. By all accounts, Charmini belonged to the latter. Her grade 9 homeroom teacher, Jody White, remembers her as a peacemaker, the one who would always notice if another student was lonely or in trouble. But she wasn't a pushover. She had opinions and she wanted to be heard. At around 9 a.m. on that June morning, Charmini left the apartment, but neglected to leave a contact number as she'd promised. Kathiz walked his sister to the elevator. She pressed the button. The elevators opened. She stepped inside and the doors closed. Then she disappeared. Around the same time, Stanley Tippett was driving by the building on his way to a job cutting grass. Tippett, who was 23 at the time, had lived with his wife and their infant son 1 floor below the Anandavilles. Just a couple of weeks earlier, he and his family had packed up and moved to Oshawa, but he still had work in the area, so he was back that Saturday. Charmini's family believed she'd gotten her job through Tippett, who was well known in the building, especially among the children. He only worked odd jobs, so he was often hanging around. He'd take the kids in the building swimming at a North York pool and teach them judo. His appearance was also distinctive. He has Treacher-Collins syndrome, a genetic condition that affects the bone development of his face. His eyes slant down away from his nose. He has a receding chin and notably small ears. From a young age, he wore hearing aids. When he was little, he was bullied a lot, says Tippett's mother, Susan Anderson. People would make fun of the way he looked, beat him up. He also had a reputation for making up stories. He once told a group of boys in the building that he was a police officer and needed one of their bikes for an investigation. Tippett was not an officer, nor had he ever worked with police. But some of the children, including Kathies, believed he was a former cop. He would often patrol the building, and he wore a police jacket he bought at a flea market. When Charmini didn't arrive home that evening from her new job, her parents were frantic. It wasn't like her to be late. They didn't know Tippett had moved, so they ran down to his unit banging on his door. When there was no answer, the Anandavels called the police. Since Charmini was a mere teen, authorities took on the case as a priority and immediately launched a grand search operation. They coordinated with local volunteers to form search parties and even used all the available facilities. The family was still hopeful Charmini would come home. She didn't fit the profile of a runaway, but maybe she had a secret life. Maybe there was a boy. Maybe she'd been kidnapped and was being held for ransom. Her parents even consulted psychics who told them she was still alive. They desperately wanted her story to be told, but racist rumors swirled in the press. Some reports suggested her disappearance had to do with an arranged marriage or Tamil gangs, which were waging public street battles in the late 90s. But despite that, everything in Charmini's file pointed to kidnapping. Few thought she'd be found alive. Tippett quickly became the prime suspect, and police were closely tracking his movements. They discovered he'd sold his car to a junkyard and seized it before it could be destroyed. But the vehicle didn't yield any clues. The only suspicious detail was that the trunk liner had been removed. Police never found it. Ultimately, police had to let Tippett go, and the case remained technically unsolved. One day, reporters followed him from his apartment to the Canadian Tire store in Oshawa. In the parking lot, Tippett approached them and demanded to know why they were following him. He assumed they were police officers. When they explained that they were journalists, he relaxed and sat carelessly on the trunk of the car. Then he talked and talked. He seemed to relish the attention. He was well-spoken and polite, meticulously describing what happened after Charmini disappeared. He said the last time he'd seen Charmini was a week before he'd moved out of his Don Mills apartment. Less than 24 hours after she was reported missing, he said, a dozen police cruisers converged on his Oshawa home. He was driven to 33 Division in the back of a cruiser. He didn't have a lawyer during his interrogation. I have nothing to hide, he told. Why do I need my lawyer? He vehemently denied he had offered Charmini any kind of job, but admitted he had given her an application for a position at the local pool and suggested that was likely why Charmini's parents were confused. The cops were following me all over the place, Tippett said. I just figured I'll let them do their job. They're just wasting their time and wasting taxpayers' money. On July 1st, we ran his story under the headline, Man's Life Hell Since Teen Vanished. It's been 4 months since she disappeared. In October 1999, a father and son hiking the Easton Parkland Trail discovered human remains beside the river. There wasn't much to find. The hot summer had caused rapid decomposition, and coyotes had ravaged whatever was left. All that was found were a skull and some bone fragments. No useful DNA or forensic evidence. Dental records confirmed Charmini's identity. Toronto homicide detectives, Matt Crone and Greg McLean, were assigned to the file. They were veteran investigators, big in both stature and reputation. The most crucial clue they uncovered wasn't at Charmini's burial site, but in her bedroom. It was a fake application for something called the Metro Search Unit. Police believe this may have been the bogus job offer, the ruse her killer used to lure her from her home. In spite of this, both the police and Charmini's family were pretty sure that they knew who had killed her. Even before her body was found, fingers were pointing at Stanley Tippett, the neighbor who had allegedly helped her find the job she was headed to when she went missing. Tippett had a history of impersonating a police officer and had already had a couple of brushes with the law, dating back as far as 1991 when he was just 16 years old. The initial investigation into Charmini's disappearance was highly challenging as there were no leads to work with. While no one knew what exactly had happened to the 15-year-old, authorities were able to gain some information after interviewing some neighbors. For starters, One neighbor claimed to have seen Charmini at the Fairview Mall at around 10:30 a.m. on the day of her murder, while another mentioned that the teen was wandering alone in Peanut Plaza at around 11:45. However, all of them talked about Charmini's friendly nature and insisted that she did not have any enemies who would target her this horrific way. Though Stanley Tippett was never charged in Charmini's death, he had several more encounters with the law in the years since, one of which ultimately landed him indefinitely behind bars. By 2004, Tippett was 28 and his family was growing. Eventually, he and his wife would have 5 children, 3 of whom inherited Treacher-Collins syndrome. They lived in a townhouse in Collingwood. In September of that year, Tippett began stalking one of his neighbors, a young single mother. He'd look in her windows and sit in his van and stare at her home. He offered her rides. At one point, he made false claims to the Children's Aid Society, saying she was unable to look after her 6-year-old son. Murray Piper, who lived nearby, told me he tried to help the woman, warning her against going anywhere alone with Tippett. Piper didn't know about Charmini's case, but said he got a bad feeling about how Tippett acted around women, including Piper's daughter. She was 10, and Tippett offered to drive her to dance class. "No way," Piper said. Soon, the woman Tippett was stalking contacted police, and he was charged with criminal harassment. He pleaded guilty, telling the court he was sorry for upsetting his neighbor. Tippett and his family moved to Peterborough the following year. One day in October 2005, at a Walmart job fair, he noticed a 21-year-old woman and introduced himself as Jason Armstrong. She had recently immigrated to Canada and told him she was desperate for work so she could sponsor her husband to come here from the Netherlands. Tippett promised her a job, not at Walmart, but at the YMCA. Over the next 8 days, he regularly contacted this woman. Once, he arrived at her home with a birthday card. Another day, he ran into her. By accident, he says, at a Taco Bell. The woman was applying for a job, which angered Tippett since he'd already offered her one. Tippett gave her a phony YMCA application, which she filled out. He told her they'd be working with the fire and police departments when people went missing. The woman became suspicious and called the Y to verify that there were job openings and that someone named Jason worked there. The YMCA called police and Tippett was arrested. In late December, he pleaded guilty to criminal harassment and the attempted kidnapping charges were dropped. Justice Lornchester noted how much worse the situation could have been. It is not a quantum leap to think that we are dealing with a situation that could have escalated to physical violence against the victim. Tippett was sentenced to 2 years in prison and a further 3 years probation. Smith explains that he had weekly check-ins with Stanley Tippett, who harbored animosity towards him for challenging the veracity of his statements. Despite efforts to oversee Tippett's behavior, Smith emphasizes the difficulty of effective management without continuous surveillance or tracking mechanisms. He concludes that even the most comprehensive offender management strategies are inadequate to prevent repeat offenses by individuals with predatory inclinations, which he did on August 6, 2008, soon after his release. Tippett had started up an affair with a woman he'd met on the dating website, Plenty Offish, who believed he was separated from his wife. In fact, Tippett had told his wife he'd been in Toronto for kidney dialysis. Late that night, he was driving home from his girlfriend's house when he spotted 2 drunk young girls. One of them, just 12 years old, was lying down in the middle of the road. He stopped and offered them a ride, and the girls hopped into his van. He dropped one of them off at a nearby park, and she made it home. The other one, the 12-year-old, didn't. Her family called the police at around 2 a.m. in Cortez, about a 50-minute drive southwest of Peterborough. A resident heard screams coming from the woods near a high school. A young girl was yelling, "Please no." The resident called the police. When a Durham police officer arrived on the scene, he saw a man come out of the woods and jump into a red van. The officer pursued the vehicle, swerving through residential streets at high speeds, but the chase was called off when dispatch decided it was too dangerous. Police found the girl at the school stumbling from the woods, crying and incoherent. Her shirt was torn and she was naked from the waist down. The officer would later identify Tippett as the driver of the van. Smith was about to put out an Amber Alert for the missing girl when Peterborough police got a call about the incident in Cortez. Based on descriptions from the Durham officer and the victim's friend, Smith was certain they were looking for Tippett. Then his phone rang. He couldn't believe the voice on the line. It was Tippett. He told Smith that after he dropped off the first girl, he'd been held at gunpoint and his van had been stolen. Smith knew he was lying. Within half an hour, they had him under arrest. At his trial in December 2009, Tippett maintained his innocence. He admitted picking up the girls, but repeated what he told Smith, that he'd been carjacked by two men, thrown out of his vehicle and dumped at the side of the road. Those were the men, he said, who attacked the girl. Tippett was also a victim, he insisted. Justice Bruce Glass was not convinced. "I do not believe the testimony of Mr. Tippett," he told the court. Tippett was convicted of sexual assault. He was again behind bars, likely for a long time. In Canada, a life sentence isn't really for life. Offenders are eligible to apply for parole after 25 years. But in 1977, Canada introduced the dangerous offender designation reserved for the most violent criminals and sexual predators, designed to keep them in prison indefinitely. There have been 921 dangerous offender designations since then. Nearly 70% have at least one conviction for a sexual offense. After Tippett's sexual assault conviction, the Crown applied for him to be declared a dangerous offender. The threshold for the designation is high. The Crown has to prove that the offender is likely to offend again by showing a pattern of persistent and violent behavior. In his 49-page submission, Crown Attorney James Hughes argued that Mr. Tippett is a stranger to the truth. As part of his pattern of repetitive, aggressive, and sexual behavior, he lies to the targets: his wife, doctors, CAS officials and police officers, school officials, probation officers, his assessing psychiatrist, and to the court. To prove their case, the Crown went far beyond Tippett's 3 adult convictions, all the way back to 1991, when he lit his teacher's desk on fire. They described how a year later, when Tippett was still a minor, he followed a teenage girl off a bus, told her to lie down, and held a pellet gun to her head. The girl believed she was going to be raped. Witnesses for the Crown also included a cashier at a grocery store in Oshawa, who had to get a no trespass order against Tippett when he wouldn't leave her alone. Rosemary Hinks, a principal from the Peterborough Elementary School that Tippett's children attended, described him as controlling and aggressive. She obtained a no trespass order for him when she became concerned about the safety of students and teachers. Tippett's lawyers argued that his risk could be managed in the community with intensive counseling and the use of anti-androgen medication, a form of chemical castration, to control his sexual behavior. There were also 2 psychiatric assessments, one presented at the request of the court and another on Tippett's behalf. Tippett only agreed to meet with the defense's psychiatrist. The Crown's doctor had to rely on documents. Both doctors agreed that he showed a sexual preference for prepubescent males and pubescent females, and that he could not be relied on to tell the truth. Justice Glass sided with the Crown, and in October 2011 designated Tippett a dangerous offender with an indefinite sentence. He is now eligible to apply for parole every 2 years, but parole for dangerous offenders is rarely granted. In 2018, his application was denied. Although you say that you take responsibility for your actions, the parole board ruled, "You constantly attempted to present your offending in a positive light as you claim that you try to help people, but it gets you in trouble." Your parole officer commented that you have delusions in that regard, and the board agrees. The arrest and incarceration of Stanley Tippett may well keep a dangerous predator off the streets, assuming the allegations against him are accurate. And yet, it does little to shed light on the tragic death of Charmini and Andeville. Tippett continues to maintain his innocence in that case as well. In interviews, he refers to it only as the Don Mills incident for the neighborhood where he and Charmini lived at the time, and doesn't use Charmini's name. As for the authorities, while investigators like Matt Crone may be absolutely certain that Tippett is the culprit, they have never had enough evidence to charge him in Charmini's death, and it's possible that they never will. So for now, Charmini's murder remains classified as a cold case listed as Homicide 36 for 1999. And both authorities and Charmini's family must live without the closure that a charge against Tippett or anyone else might bring. Born in 1961, Jeremy Bamber was adopted by June and Neville Bamber, a married couple who lived on the sprawling White House farm in Essex County. Unable to have biological children, the Bambers decided to open their home to abandoned infants. Their first adoption was a 3-month-old baby girl, whom they named Phyllis, though she was affectionately called Sheila. A few years later, they adopted 6-month-old Jeremy. During their early childhood, both Sheila and Jeremy were relatively trouble-free. However, Jeremy's rebellious nature became evident in his teenage years, clashing starkly with the Bambers' strict principles and religious beliefs. As a teenager, Jeremy frequently got into trouble, engaging in fights, thefts, and burglaries. He also developed a heroin addiction, further straining the relationship with his parents. Adding to the tension, Jeremy's bisexuality outraged his deeply religious adoptive parents, creating an even wider rift within the family. For several years, he tried to find himself in Australia, but eventually returned to the UK. He couldn't hold down any job for long and eventually began working on his parents' farm. These, despite the disappointments he brought them, decided to give him another chance. The life of his sister Sheila, who seemed to be the apple of their parents' eye, definitely could not be called peaceful or happy. An unsuccessful modeling career, an abortion performed after parental pressure, an unhappy relationship with Colin Cahill, diagnosed schizophrenia and stays in psychiatric institutions made Sheila Bamber, already in her 20s, a person severely tested by life. In 1979, she gave birth to Cahill's twins, Daniel and Nicholas, but this did not save their marriage. Sheila's lifestyle, partying with friends with alcohol and drugs, hanging out with older men, and even sunbathing naked greatly displeased June, who could call her daughter Satan's spawn. Sheila, on the other hand, was furious every time June forced her sons to pray. This severely damaged mother-daughter relationship and her health problems were later to be cruelly exploited by Jeremy. In early August 1985, White House Farm was visited by both Sheila and her children and Jeremy. She came to visit from London. He stopped by for dinner. They had a meal with their parents. The atmosphere was calm, and June and Sheila, according to the testimony of the farm's employees, spoke kindly to each other. However, on the night of August 7th, Jeremy Bamber made a shaky call to the police with the news that something bad was happening at his family home. When Jeremy and the policemen arrived at the scene, they found that all the household members were dead. Traces of a struggle were visible in the house. Neville Bamber lay dead on the kitchen floor. His wife was in blood-stained pajamas in the bedroom. Daniel and Nicholas were dead in their beds. Sheila was also in her parents' bedroom. She had 2 gunshot wounds under her chin, indicating that she had taken her own life. The gun was lying next to her. The investigation kicked off the next morning. White House Farm employees were questioned. Sheila's ex-husband was called in, as well as relatives of the Bamber family. Also questioned was Jeremy, who admitted that in the middle of the night his father called him and said his sister had gone crazy and had a gun. The phone was said to have dropped in the middle of the conversation, so Jeremy notified the police. He also reportedly called his girlfriend Julie Mugford. At first, everything pointed to the fact that it was indeed the emotionally unstable Sheila who carried out the murder of the family. However, it was difficult for the police to piece together the evidence collected from the scene. How could petite Sheila overcome her father, who measured over 190 centimeters? How did she shoot at least one person without alarming the other household members? Did she use a silencer? If so, she wouldn't have been able to aim the weapon under her jaw and effectively take her own life because her arms were too short. Or was this shocking crime committed by someone else? Crowds gathered at the funeral of the Bamber family. Everyone said goodbye to the farmers, their daughter and 2 small boys. Walking behind the coffin, Jeremy seemed distraught, but did not cry, which aroused the suspicions of the police. Moreover, after the ceremony, the 24-year-old went out to dinner with friends. This seemed suspicious to those members of his family who wanted to mourn together, but were ignored. A few days after the murders, things took a different turn. The police found a silencer hidden in a drawer, and on it the blood of Bamber and Sheila. This meant that the woman had been shot with a suppressed weapon, which, as previously established, was impossible. In addition, no traces of gunpowder were found on her hands, so she was not the one who shot her parents and children. Suspicions immediately fell on Jeremy. Contributing significantly to Bamber's arrest and indictment was Julie, who confessed to police that her boyfriend was planning the perfect murder and that his main motive was money. He confessed to her that although his parents' wills indicated that he and Sheila would each receive half of the estate, he had no intention of sharing. At the time of his loved ones' deaths, 24-year-old Jeremy became the heir to a £400,000 at the time. It was a fortune. He was first arrested on September 8th. A few days later, he was released from custody on bail and left on a trip to St. Tropez with a friend. During this time, he tried to sell nude photos of Sheila to the press. He was arrested again on September 29th. He was charged with 5 counts of murder. The trial began on October 3, 1986, with the defendant asserting his innocence and the defense trying to undermine the evidence and Julie Mugford's testimony. According to the attorneys, the girl was coerced into plunging Bamberg by the police. This did not convince the jury. By a significant margin, Jeremy Bamber received a life sentence. He was declared one of the most dangerous criminals in Britain. In the 35 years since the verdict, Jeremy Bamber has sought a retrial several times, but his requests have been denied. The last time he did so was in March 2021. He continues to maintain that he is innocent. For many teenage girls, the prospect of their first boyfriend is an exciting milestone, a time filled with tender moments and the thrill of being chosen by someone special. For 17-year-old Ellie Gold, this was no different. She had recently begun dating her longtime crush, Thomas Griffiths, a fellow classmate she had admired since the 7th grade. Ellie had been infatuated with Thomas for years, so when their relationship finally became official, she was overjoyed. However, as with many first loves, the intensity of their relationship began to wane almost as quickly as it had blossomed. After just 3 months of dating, Ellie decided to end things. She realized she wasn't ready for the commitment of a serious relationship and wanted to focus on her schoolwork and upcoming exams. Ellie anticipated that Thomas would be heartbroken by her decision but hoped they could remain friends. She was confident he would move on and eventually accept the breakup, believing their young love would fade into a distant memory. She didn't notice any red flags, and she definitely didn't expect what would happen next. The following morning, Ellie stayed home from school. She didn't have any classes that morning, so her parents allowed her to stay home and revise for the upcoming exams. Thomas thought that he was going to see Ellie at school that morning, and he was planning on calling her for a chat so that they could discuss the breakup the previous evening, most likely hoping that she would have changed her mind and agree to give the relationship another chance. When he realized that Ellie wasn't at school that morning, he walked to a nearby bus station at 8:30 a.m. and took a bus back home. After he got to his house, he then took the family's car and drove to the home of Ellie Gould. 2 hours later, Ellie was dead. Thomas Griffiths had strangled her until she became unconscious and then took a knife from her kitchen and stabbed her in the neck a total of 13 times. He then proceeded to clean up the scene and then stage it to look as though it was a suicide. Ellie Gould was born on February 6, 2002 and lived in Cannes, a small town in Wiltshire located in the southwest of England. She was a fun-loving girl who came from a stable family, had a close-knit group of friends, and she was someone who had a bright future ahead of her. In 2019, she was 17 years old and studying towards her A-levels in school. She was already preparing for the next phase of her life and had big dreams and aspirations for her future. She was planning on enrolling in university the following year, where her plan was to study psychology. She also had a passion for horse riding and animals in general, and even toyed with the idea of joining the mounted police just so that she could work with horses. Ellie was also someone who any parent would be proud of. In addition to her friendly nature and approachable personality, she was also a hardworking and responsible young lady who embodied the qualities of diligence and responsibility. She had a clear vision for her future and would do everything in her power to achieve her goals. She knew her responsibilities well, and her parents could rest easy, knowing that she embraced her academic obligations, and they never had to worry if she was studying for exams or if her homework was completed. In early 2019, just as Ellie turned 17, she informed her parents that a boy at school had asked her out and that they'd started dating. His name was Thomas Griffiths, and he was also an A-level student at Ellie's school. She'd known him since the 7th grade and had always had a crush on him, so she was pretty ecstatic when they finally made it official. He came from a stable family and also seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. He was a rugby player for the school's first team and also a prefect at his school. He was actually Ellie's very first boyfriend, and although her parents would have preferred for her to focus on her schooling and not worry about boys, they also knew that teenage love was something delicate and something they needed to manage. They told Ellie that they would allow her to date, but that they wanted to meet Thomas. So they invited him over for dinner to get to know him a bit better. As they sat in the kitchen having dinner that evening, Ellie's parents kept a close eye on Thomas, trying to get a gauge of his character. Although there weren't any obvious red flags, her parents had noted that he was very quiet and didn't talk much. They attributed it to his age and the nerves of meeting Ellie's family, but deep down, doubts lingered. Her parents were certain that the relationship between Ellie and Thomas wouldn't last long. They found the two of them to be incompatible and didn't think it would work out. They obviously didn't tell Ellie about this, as they wanted her to make up her mind for herself. So they gave Thomas a chance, but knew deep down that the relationship would eventually fizzle out. 3 months into dating Thomas, signs started showing that Ellie was becoming frustrated with their relationship. She grew tired of having to see him every day and never having any time for herself. He wanted to be around her 247 and would get grumpy if she wanted to spend any time with her friends. Ellie also wanted to focus on her A-levels, but found it hard to balance her life with the unrealistic expectations Thomas placed on her. She realized that she wasn't ready for a serious relationship, yet Thomas was already starting to talk about marriage. In the beginning of May 2019, Ellie told her mom that she was going to break up with Thomas. Not exactly shocked by the news, her mom asked her if anything happened and if she wanted to talk. Ellie assured her mom that nothing happened and that she just wanted to be single, so she told her mom not to worry and that she had everything under control. Ellie then went to her room and broke up with Thomas via text message. During the text conversations, Thomas kept denying the breakup, telling Ellie that he loved her and that they belonged together. But Ellie had made up her mind and stood firm in her decision. That evening, she asked her parents if she could stay home the following morning because she didn't have any classes scheduled until the afternoon. She thought that she could use the time to revise for her upcoming exams before heading to school in the afternoon to attend history class. Her parents agreed, and Ellie arranged with one of her closest friends to pick her up the following morning at 11 a.m. so that they could journey to school together. The following morning was May 3rd, 2019. Thomas walked into the school cafeteria and asked Ellie's friends if they'd seen her. He'd been looking for her the entire morning, as he wanted to discuss the breakup they had the previous evening. When Thomas heard that Ellie wasn't in school that morning, he wasted no time in trying to find her. He told one of the teachers that he wasn't feeling well, so he walked to the bus station nearby and took a bus back home. When he got to his house, he immediately changed his clothes. He put on a black hoodie and also took off his white sneakers and opted for his black ones. But just as he was about to leave the house, his mother arrived home. It seemed that she had come to pick up something. Thomas didn't want his mother to know that he skipped school, so he hid inside one of his cupboards and stayed there until she left. The minute she left, Thomas got out of the cupboard and took the keys to the family's spare car and set off towards Ellie's home about a 10-minute drive away. When he got to Ellie's house, he knocked on her front door and told her that he wanted to speak to her. The two allegedly spoke in the kitchen, and an argument soon broke out after Thomas realized that Ellie was serious about the breakup. At some point during the argument, he started strangling Ellie, who was desperately fighting for her life, hitting and scratching Thomas, hoping he would let go. Thomas wasn't letting go though, and continued to strangle Ellie until she passed out. He then went to grab a knife from the kitchen drawer and repeatedly stabbed Ellie in her neck, a total of 13 times. After he realized that she was dead, he took the knife out of her neck and went to wash it in the basin, making sure that he washed off his fingerprints. He then placed the knife back into Ellie's neck and placed her hand over the knife to make it look as though the wounds were self-inflicted. Thomas then proceeded to clean the crime scene before unlocking Ellie's phone and texting her friend pretending to be Ellie. He told the friend that she was no longer coming to school and that the friend didn't need to pick her up, ensuring that Ellie's body wouldn't be found until at least the afternoon. He then realized that Ellie had left scratch marks on his face and neck, so he set out to create an alibi for himself. He wrote a message in the group chat he had with friends, telling them that he was going through a difficult time due to the breakup and that he was scratching himself in an attempt at self-harm. After he posted the message to the group, he then sent a few messages to Ellie's phone, asking if they could meet up and talk about their relationship. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, Ellie's dad had come home from work. When police examined the scene, they quickly realized that this was no suicide and that foul play was involved. They told Ellie's parents that they were investigating a murder before telling them that the killer was often someone known to the victim. They then asked her parents if they knew of anyone who would hurt Ellie, and the only name they could come up with was that of Thomas Griffiths. Police went to Thomas's house to question him about Ellie Gold. They immediately noticed the fresh scratch marks on his face. Thomas denied having anything to do with Ellie's murder, but police knew that there was more to the story. They took a look at his family's Wi-Fi router settings and realized that Thomas's phone disconnected from the home's Wi-Fi network shortly after he arrived home from school that morning. His phone remained disconnected from the network for a few hours before it reconnected after 12 p.m. They suspected that this was the time that Ellie was murdered, so they looked at surveillance footage of the area around Ellie's home. At 11:56, CCTV from a passing bus caught a silver Ford Fiesta leaving the area where Ellie lived. The vehicle registration number was pretty clear on the footage, and police were able to trace it back to the vehicle belonging to the Griffiths family. With no other member of the family being home during that time, it was clear that it could only have been Thomas behind the wheel. Thomas Griffiths, however, continued to deny his involvement in the murder and denied being at the scene of the crime. Police then took a second look at the family's Wi-Fi router and realized that Thomas's phone connected to the home network after 12 p.m. before disconnecting for an 18-minute period. Police then looked at the area surrounding Thomas's house and realized that there was a wooded area nearby. So police walked out of his front door and timed themselves walking for exactly 9 minutes towards the wooded area. As soon as they hit the 9-minute mark, they stopped and started looking around. They very quickly found a black bin liner, and inside they found blood-stained napkins, cloths, and towels, which would later be confirmed to contain Ellie's DNA. A search of Thomas's room also produced a pair of black sneakers found to contain Ellie's blood on them. With the evidence stacked against Thomas, he was arrested and charged with the murder of Ellie Gold. In August 2019, Thomas Griffiths informed the court that he intended to plead guilty to murder. He told the court that he went to Ellie's home on the morning of May 2, 2019. He said that an argument broke out and that he blacked out after that and that he couldn't remember what happened next. The state pointed out that although blind rage can make you forget things, in their opinion, it was clear that Thomas had planned everything carefully. He left school and went to change clothes first. He cleaned up the scene and tried to make it look like a suicide. He texted Ellie's friend to ensure that she wasn't found, and he even tried to dispose of the evidence and create an alibi for himself. In November 2019, the Bristol Crown Court sentenced Thomas Griffiths to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The court mentioned his age as a mitigating circumstance, as the law in Britain doesn't allow for whole life terms for offenders under the age of 18. The court also said that due to the fact that Thomas didn't bring a weapon to the scene and instead made use of a knife from the Gould household, they weren't convinced that it was premeditated murder. Thomas Griffiths will become eligible for parole in 2031. He will be 29 years old. This time, we delve into a notorious case from Poland, set in the quiet village of Rakowiska, located in the Lubelski Voivodeship. He was an introverted teenager from a respectable family, the son of a military officer and a teacher. She was a sensitive young woman, a poet who had already published her first collection of poetry. Nothing in their lives seemed to foreshadow the horrifying tragedy that would unfold. Certainly not anything noticeable to the small community of fewer than 1,500 residents. The events of one December night in 2014 left the entire village reeling in shock. It was Saturday, December 13th, 2014. Early that morning, the police received a call from a neighbor of Mr. and Mrs. Niedzwiecki. The neighbor reported hearing screams during the night and, at dawn, noticing the front door slightly ajar with brown stains on the wall. Assuming it was a burglary, the neighbor alerted the authorities. When officers arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a grisly sight. The exterior of the house and the front door were smeared with blood. Inside, they found the lifeless bodies of a 48-year-old man and a 42-year-old woman. Agnieszka Niedzwiecka lay by the front door, her body marking the horrific events that had taken place that night. As came to light during the investigation, she managed to get out of the house but was dragged back into it by the killer. Jerzy Niedzwiecka was found in the bedroom. He had cut marks on his hands with a blunt knife. The killers had tried to cut off his hands. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, the curtains, the walls inside and outside. Numerous cuts and stab wounds were revealed on the bodies of the victims. For Agnieszka Niedzwiecka, the wound inflicted on her forearm, which caused a severed artery, proved fatal. The immediate cause of death for Jerzy Niedzwiecka, on the other hand, was the blows inflicted in the abdomen, resulting in a hemorrhage into the abdominal cavity. The perpetrators were found quickly. On the same day, the police tracked down in Krakow the son of the murdered Kamal Niedzwiecka and Zuzanna Maksimiuk, his partner and accomplice in crime. In fact, the only motive for the crime was that the parents did not approve of their son's relationship with Zuzanna. They stood in the way of their love and did not allow them to meet. The girl did not have a good reputation. She used drugs and, as came to light during the investigation, she also had another crime on her record: intercourse with a 15-year-old girl and giving drugs to minors. In 2015, Zuzanna was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for these offenses. She was allegedly a bad influence on Kamil. The toxicity of this friendship was actually seen by everyone, seen by the teachers, seen by the class tutor. He became a completely different person. He stopped having any other friends apart from Zuzanna, I believe. He also adopted Zuzanna's views on certain things. He became such a copy of her. She influenced the defendant's psyche. She influenced the psyche of anyone she wanted to influence, was how Kamil's classmate testified during one of the first hearings. How did the murder take place? They planned everything with premeditation and almost clockwork precision. There was even an alibi. The youngsters announced that they were going with friends to Zuzanna's poetry evening, which was to be held in Krakow. They also took care of their clothes. Zuzanna and Kamil traveled to Warsaw, especially for this purpose, where they bought rubber gloves and overalls. Apparently, they were inspired by the film American Psycho, and she regretted not being able to find a coat like the one worn by the murderer in the film in a shop. Before they entered the house to carry out the crime, Kamil took the dog outside so that it would not disturb their plan. What happened to the dog? This was not mentioned by anyone afterwards. The crime was exceptionally brutal. The media were unraveling the details, especially after the killers themselves revealed them during a site visit. The victims defended themselves, which seemed to further fuel the aggression of the perpetrators. Jerzy almost managed to break away from Zuzanna and snatch the knife from her, but at that moment, his son caught up with him, dealing blows to his back. During the struggle, the girl bit Jerzy's hand, and in an attempt to remove the traces of her teeth and DNA, tried to cut that hand off. Agnes almost managed to escape, but her son dragged her back into the house and slit her throat several times. Afterwards, the young murderers got into their friend's car and drove towards Krakow. On the way, they told their friends about what they had done. They then stopped at the flat of another friend in Krakow. This one was to recount later in court that they had behaved unusually. They were dirty, had no shoes, and told that they had been mugged. When she received a text message from her friend informing her of the death of Kamil's parents, she asked him to call the police. And thus Kamil and Zuzanna were arrested just a few hours after the murder. They confessed immediately, at first expressing no remorse for what they had done. He detailed the course of the crime. She spoke of a satisfying job. During the interview, she also asserted that she felt more and more elated, happier with each blow. The time for reflection came later during the trial. First, they were both referred for examination and psychiatric observation lasting several weeks, 8 in the case of Kamil, as a result of which they were declared sane and aware of their own actions. In June 2015, the regional prosecutor's office in Lublin filed an indictment against Zuzanna and Kamil, as well as a number of people who had not fully consciously assisted them, to the regional court in Lublin. A fierce battle ensued in the courtroom. The line of defense of the lawyers for both defendants was largely based on shifting blame to the other side. Susanna's defense argued that Camille was the whole world to the girl and that she was dependent on him. According to Camille's defense counsel, on the other hand, Camille was not born a killer, but became one under the influence of his girlfriend. Between the pair of killers, the love that motivated them to commit the crime apparently burned out, and the fight for survival began. Who was under whose influence? Is it possible to measure how guilty each of them was, and perhaps one more so? In the end, it did not matter to the court. On December 4, 2015, they both heard the same sentence, 25 years imprisonment. They would probably have got more had it not been for their young age, the fact that they pleaded guilty, and finally, at the last moment, remorse. The sentence would also have been harsher if in 2017, the cessation of the general prosecutor's Big News Jobro, who demanded a life sentence for both of them, had not been dismissed. At the time of the crime, Susanna Maximyuk was 18 years old and a student of the high school in Biawab, Alaska. As a child, she grew up without her father, with whom she did not establish contact until her teenage years. Shortly after she started to establish family contact with her father, he died. The girl was very much affected by this, and according to her own words, after these events, she decided to pursue a career in poetry. She wrote poems, and a few months before the attack, she published her first volume of poetry entitled 33 using the literary pseudonym Maria Ganyevich. At the school she attended, she was known for skipping classes and manipulating her peers. She was active on social media, including Facebook, where she also published poems on her fan page, along with her own black and white filtered photos, graphics that were anti-religious or could offend religious feelings, and people with knives. In 2012, she entered into the previously mentioned intimate relationship with a younger female pupil of the school she was attending at the time, and as the pupil was under 15 years old at the time, Maximyuk committed an offense. She was sentenced to a suspended prison sentence for sexual intercourse with a minor and for making marijuana available to minors. This was a few months before the next sentence in the Rakawiska crime trial. Camille was also 18 years old at the time of the crime and was a student at the Khrushchevsky High School in Biawab, Alaska. According to his schoolmates and teachers, the student had not caused any problems before. These started when he met Susanna and entered into a romantic relationship with her. He then started skipping school and spending practically all his time with his girlfriend, which his parents did not like very much. He had also started to take drugs, which she was supposed to have given him. The perpetrators, in their own words, began planning the crime while watching films filled with violence and aggression. On one occasion, during one such film screening, Susanna was said to have joked that they could also murder Camille's parents in the same way as in one of the films. At first, they were both to consider it a joke, but then they began to plan the crime seriously. The motive was supposed to be mainly the lack of acceptance of their relationship by the boyfriend's parents. Moreover, during a drive to Krakow with two of their friends after the crime had already been committed, Susanna told them about the murder they had committed, also telling them that she would get 200,000 zloty from the sale of the cars of the boyfriend's slain parents for their silence on the matter. According to many experts and people who looked into the case, Susanna may have manipulated her boyfriend into committing this crime. Although there is no clear evidence of this, Rakawiska is a village described as the bedroom of Biawab, Podlaska. The nice new houses are mostly inhabited by border guards and customs officers. In the summer of 2016, the 186 square meter house where the crime took place was put up for sale. The advertiser did not mention what happened in December 2014. The price was lowered several times until finally someone was tempted. According to local media reports, the building is currently occupied. I don't think anyone will ever know what was really going on in Camel's head when he and his girlfriend, Susanna, inflicted the fatal blows on his parents, nor can anyone establish what had previously happened within the four walls of the beautiful new house in which the family had moved a few months before the tragedy. The reason for this murder will never be known. It lies somewhere deep within one person and another, Professor Marek Konopczynski, a resocialization pedagogue, said back in 2014 in an interview. A scenic cabin tucked into the Utah mountains became the site of a shocking and senseless crime. During winter, the remote area was accessible only by snowmobile. A rookie deputy described the scene as resembling a miniature war zone. It was late December 1990, just before Christmas, and sisters Leanie Tid, 20, and Trish, 16, eagerly anticipated spending the holidays with their family at their cabin in Weber Canyon near Oakley, Utah. The cabin, located 2 miles off the road, offered a peaceful retreat from everyday life. Affectionately named Tita's Tranquility, the cabin was a cherished escape, providing solitude and a place for family gatherings. In winter, the snow-covered roads added to its seclusion, making it a haven from the outside world. On December 22nd, just 2 days before Christmas Eve, the family left the cabin to run last-minute errands in Salt Lake City. Unbeknownst to them, 2 men had broken into their beloved retreat and were waiting inside as they shopped. 25-year-old Vaughn Lester Taylor and 21-year-old Stephen Deli were parolees who should have been out job hunting and were instead out on the run for more than a week from a halfway house they'd left on December 14. Deli had been in prison for 5 years for arson in 1989, while Taylor was serving 15 years for aggravated burglary. While in the cabin, Taylor called a fellow prisoner from the Orange Street Community Correction Center in Salt Lake City and told the person that they were planning to burglarize some cabins. And while they were at it, they would wait for the residents of the home to arrive so they could shoot them and take their car. As Leanie, Kay, and Beth finished their shopping and headed home, they had no idea the danger that awaited them. The trio were the first to arrive, and as they made their way through the snow and bitter cold, they began to approach the front door. Leanie asked her mom to hurry and unlock the door since her hands were freezing cold. As she waited by the door, she saw a flash of movement near the refrigerator and assumed a cousin had arrived and planned to jump out at her when she came inside and scare her in good fun. As she got inside and began to set her things down, Leanie watched in horror as a frizzy-haired man in a gray sweatshirt came out from his hiding spot behind the refrigerator, holding a gun that he pointed at her. Her first thought was that he was going to rob them and be on his way. As her mom got to the top of the stairs, another man came out of hiding in the back bedroom wearing thick Coke bottle glasses, also holding a gun. Kay asked the men what they wanted and told them they could have anything they wanted. Seconds after Kay finished speaking without any warning or hesitation, Taylor shot Beth and Kay before they could even grasp what was happening. Leanie remembers watching in horror as her mom fell to the ground, and the next thing she knew, she looked over her shoulder and saw her grandmother get shot in the head. She said that blood sprayed everywhere and her grandmother gasped for breath. She said that everything seemed to be moving in slow motion as her mom grasped her chest and said, "I've been shot." The room suddenly grew still, and Line knew at that point that both her mom and grandma were gone. Despite the trauma she had just experienced, Line began to quickly think, trying to figure out how the rest of her family could get out of the unthinkable situation alive. She had the wherewithal to try to get the men out of the cabin before her dad and little sister had a chance to arrive home, knowing that her dad typically left the car keys under the mat. Rolf and Trish were shortly behind, on their way up the mountain, completely unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Sadly, Leanie could hear the distant sound of a snowmobile getting closer, and at this point, the man in the gray sweatshirt grabbed Leanie from behind, his arm around her neck, a gun held to her back. Despite her efforts, Rolf and Trish pulled into the driveway, and one of the men immediately jumped out from the garage wearing a full ski mask and ordered them inside the cabin. This was when Rolf saw to his horror that his oldest daughter was held captive. Lanai said that Ralph saw the tears in her eyes, and they shared an unspoken communication. And at that point, Ralph knew that something terrible had happened to his wife and mother-in-law. The men asked Rolf if he had money, and he took whatever he had from his pockets and threw it to the floor. Deli, the man in the thick glasses, was instructed by Taylor to shoot Rolf, but after he cocked the gun, he refused to fire. Taylor, who was restraining Lena, pulled his gun out, pointed it at Rolf, and pulled the trigger once, but there was no fire. The same thing happened the second time he pulled the trigger. On the third attempt, they remember the blast from the gun being so intense that they could feel it. The third shot hit Rolf in the face, and he immediately crumpled to the ground. Leanie remembers feeling convinced that her father was dead, just as her mom and grandma were. As Leanie looked around the cabin, she could tell the men had been there for a while. There was food eaten, and Christmas presents had been torn open. She could tell that they hadn't been startled upon their arrival and that they had waited for them to arrive. She couldn't imagine what horror remained. The cabin was always fully stocked with gas cans for the snowmobiles, and the girls watched as the men began scurrying around, pouring gas around the cabin and set it on fire. The fire began to blaze and the smoke alarms blared. At this point, the men had a sense of urgency and told Trish and Leanie that they needed to hurry and load the snowmobiles so they could get out of there. They both listened to their instructions and hoped they could eventually make their escape. The men forced Leonie and Trish out of the house, leaving Rolf for dead. Leonie and Trish were each forced to drive a snowmobile, a man riding behind each. At this point, someone in a nearby cabin called authorities after they heard gunshots. When they looked out, they saw the snowmobiles fleeing into the distance. Trish felt sure that she and her sister would be murdered next. And as she drove, she racked her brain to come up with a way that they could escape. She expected that she and Leanie would be murdered once they reached the road. Trish had a thought to wreck the snowmobile and throw the man off and into a tree. But she couldn't bring herself to do it because she didn't want to leave her sister. She knew that at that moment, they were in the middle of the mountains, and there was no one to help them and nowhere safe to go. As they made their way down to the gate to the main road, Leanie and Trish saw their uncle, Randy Zorn, who had just arrived for a holiday visit. When Randy spotted his nieces on the snowmobiles, he assumed they were taking friends for a ride and began to wave at them. The girls, knowing that their uncle was in great risk for also being murdered, ignored his greeting and sped by. Randy thought it was very strange that his own nieces would ignore him like that. When the man on the back of her snowmobile asked who that was, Trish lied and told him it must just be a friendly person who lived up there. When they reached the spot where they parked the family car, the men forced them into the back. They each had a gun, and as they got into the car, Trish saw one of the men putting his gun into the trunk. He opened his coat and showed her that he also had a knife and warned her that he was just as good at using his knife as he was his gun. As they were pulling away, Randy saw the family's Lincoln pull out and noticed Leanie in the back. He began waving and gesturing for them to stop. Leanie and Trish continued to ignore their uncle, sure he would be killed if they acknowledged him. The car drove right by, and Randy couldn't understand what was going on and why his nieces were acting so strangely. As he continued to process what was happening, he saw another snowmobile approaching. Randy noticed that the driver was not dressed for the frigid weather, wearing no helmet, no coat, or gloves. As the snowmobile got closer, he was able to recognize that it was his brother Rolf and his face was covered in blood. Randy was shocked at the sight of Rolf and described his face as huge and full of blood. His eye was swollen shut and blood icicles hung off his face. Rolf, who had miraculously survived being shot in the face and set on fire, told Randy what had happened back at the cabin. What Leanie and Trish hadn't known at that moment was that after their dad had been shot, he played dead. After they left, he managed to struggle to the bathroom where he tore off his burning snowsuit and jumped into the shower to put out the flames. He then jumped onto the snowmobile in hopes of saving his daughters. Randy, seeing that Rolf was terribly injured, ushered Rolf into the back seat as he climbed into the driver's seat. Despite the fact that it was only 1990, Randy's car was equipped with a cell phone that he was able to use to call 911. The cell service was poor in the Kaon, and Randy called repeatedly until he connected. As he continued to call, Randy caught up to the Lincoln and tried to quickly brainstorm how to handle the situation, questioning if he should try to run the car off the road. When the call finally connected, Randy told the Summit County Sheriff's Department the direction in which the murderers were headed as he explained that he also needed a medic helicopter for his brother. The call dropped. Randy quickly found a gas station and used the payphone to call 911, and Rolf was airlifted to a hospital in critical condition. As authorities caught up with the killers, a terrifying 90-nip pursuit began through several towns until the attackers lost control of the car and tumbled down an embankment. Amazingly, the girls were not injured, and they crawled out of the car, their hands raised, and told police they were being held hostage. Police surrounded the car, and the men surrendered. Leanie begged the officers to just shoot the men, screaming that they had just killed their mom, dad, and grandma. Lenai and Trish soon learned that not only had their father been shot, but he had also been doused with gasoline and set on fire, and had somehow found the strength to blindly fly down the mountain on a snowmobile to save his daughters. They always knew their dad was their hero, but with that knowledge, it put an exclamation point on the fact. After being arrested, the men were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping. They were also charged with aggravated assault, theft, arson, and failure to heed a police signal to stop. Police later discovered that after the men had gone on the run, they hitchhiked to that particular location because Taylor's family had owned a cabin in the area. After spending several days on the mountain, breaking into various empty cabins, authorities theorized that they saw the Tita family leave, broke into their cabin, and waited for them to come back home. As police began to search the crime scene, they found a 12-18-inch puddle of blood in the garage that had quickly frozen in the sub-zero temperatures. The first deputy to arrive at the scene immediately smelled burning hair and clothing as they made their way through the cabin. Bullet holes littered the walls across from the stairwell, and the cabin looked like a mini war zone. As the house was searched, the police found that the top floor was on fire, and the once peaceful and cozy cabin was now covered in blood. The living room carpet was saturated in blood, and based on the crime scene, police could see that after the women were killed, the men dragged them across the living room floor and onto the deck outside. They covered them with a blanket and snow to hide what they'd done. Blood pooled on the wooden planks and oozed through, forming red icicles underneath. Authorities' number 1 concern was to rescue anyone in the cabin that might need assistance, and their second priority was to preserve evidence. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was a VHS tape they found inside a video camera. As investigators started to play the tape, they expected to see smiling faces on the family's home movies before their lives had been turned upside down by the vicious and random attack. Instead, they found video of the attackers opening the Theed family's Christmas presents as they sat next to their tree. The video was shot by Deli, and in the video, an armed Taylor happily ripped open the presents. Instead of celebrating Christmas together in the cozy cabin like they'd planned, 3 days after Christmas, Beth Potts was laid to rest. Linnea remembers her grandmother as an energetic woman who was fun, happy, and vivacious. She describes her as full of life and remembers that her grandma would give her home perms that she later recognized as being awful. Kay was laid to rest on the same day as her mother. Kay was known to be an extremely devoted mother who put her children at top priority. Trisha describes her mom as the perfect friend, someone who was never judgmental and always willing to open her home with love. This case was never a question of who done it, as there was no question who committed the crimes. What was a challenge was determining what criminal act each suspect committed. From Leanie's perspective, both men were equally responsible. Police learned that Vaughn Taylor had come from a normal, decent family and had a typical childhood. But at some point, he started to get in trouble with the law. Neither man was known to have a violent history. About 5 months after this horrific home invasion, Vaughn Taylor pleaded guilty to 2 counts of capital murder. The state dropped all the other charges against him in exchange for his guilty plea. He went to trial before a jury, and during his testimony, he was argumentative and had convenient memory lapses answering, "It happened so quick. I don't know." The jury decided that he should receive the death sentence for each murder. During his time in court, Taylor had no remorse and no regard for life whatsoever. When Edward Stephen Deli went to trial a couple of weeks after Taylor was sentenced, his lawyer argued that it was Taylor who did all the shooting. Investigators assumed he would also be convicted of first-degree murder. Instead, he was convicted of second-degree murder due to a holdout of 1 juror. The family was stunned by the decision, and they wanted this man to be held accountable for what he'd done. With that decision, Lynn felt that the courts did an injustice to her family. The other 11 members of the jury realized that a hung jury would mean that family would be subjected to a second trial and came to a compromise on the lesser offense. With this sentencing, the death penalty was no longer an option. During the sentencing, the judge addressed him by saying, "First and foremost, I'm struck by the senselessness and brutality of this crime. In a sense, we're all victims. Decent, law-abiding citizens must walk our streets in fear and now are fearful within the walls of their own homes. The judge recommended he spend the rest of his life behind bars and gave the maximum terms under Utah law for each of 9 felonies and ordered that they be served consecutively. Because of this, he will spend a minimum of 62 years in prison. The earliest he can be released from prison is 2053. And Judge Knowles said he would recommend that Deli never be paroled. Both Trisha and Linnea testified at their trials. And despite their young ages and the trauma they had suffered, they were phenomenal witnesses. As they described the horrors in what they lived through that day, they were sure about the things they had seen and spoke with conviction in a detailed and unemotional way. Linnea did resent that as a victim. She was required to handle the gun that was used to murder both her mother and grandmother during her testimony. When Rolf Teed came in to testify, Trish remembers seeing the shocked look on Deli's face, and it was clear that he was unaware that her father survived. At that point, Trish felt like they had won. In 2001, Deli wrote a letter to the victim's family and said that he would have pleaded guilty to the crimes, but his lawyer wouldn't allow him to do so. He explained that it was only his plan to burglarize the cabin, and he never had any intention of hurting anyone. He wrote, "I wanted to steal money, not a life. I didn't either." He claims that Taylor took the .44 caliber gun from Deli's holster and shot the victims. "I could only accept what happened and get on with it." It took Linnea over 9 years to respond to the letter, and by that point, she had probably read it about 30 times. She has since chosen to forgive him in order to regain her freedom and acknowledges that forgiving does not mean forgetting. The family plans to petition the Board of Pardons to prevent Deli from ever being set free. They feel that despite the years that go by, even if he is released as a 70-year-old man, that he is a danger and at risk for killing again. Throughout the years, Taylor had repeatedly appealed his sentence. During his 3rd trip to the Utah Supreme Court, his current attorney claimed that the autopsies prove that he is factually innocent even though he admitted to firing the first shots. He claims that the fatal wounds came from Deli's gun and that Linnea has been inconsistent with her accounts. The state disputes this, and he remains on death row. Linnea and Trish vow that they will be there on the day he is executed. After Linnea's first marriage ended in divorce, she married her childhood sweetheart and said that her husband, Nathan, changed her. She feels that because he opened his heart to her, it gave her the freedom to do the same. The couple now has a blended family with 9 children between them. Trisha is a divorced mother of 2 children, and she says that when she looks into her children's eyes, she sees her mother and father. She loves her life and feels like that horrible day from 1990 does not define her, but has helped to make her who she is today. After the fire, Rolf worked to rebuild the cabin, and according to Trisha and Linnea, he made it even better than it was before. Rolf reminded his daughter that lightning doesn't strike twice in the same location and assured them that they were safe. They still visit the cabin with family and friends. And despite the fact that Taylor and Deli took their mother and grandmother away, they will never take away the other things they still love and enjoy. The girls described the cabin as magical and healing. Rolf lived a very full and happy life, enjoying his girls and grandchildren. And when he was diagnosed with cancer, the whole family came together. The girls described the last 6 to 8 weeks of their father's life as absolutely incredible. In 2008, he passed away with his family by his side. This story takes place in France, a country synonymous with romance. It began in a manner befitting the land of lovers, but tragically did not end that way. When Lawrence and John met, both instantly believed they had found their soulmate. Young and attractive, they envisioned a long and joyful life together. However, over time, cracks in their seemingly perfect relationship began to show, revealing that things were not as they appeared. Events steadily unfolded toward a devastating conclusion. On Wednesday, November 28, 2007, at nearly 8 p.m., a distressed young man placed a call to the Jean de Marie station in Vimy, a commune near the city of Lens in France's Pas-de-Calais department. Clearly upset, he reported that his partner had not returned home after going out for an afternoon walk with their dog. The man is sure that something bad must have happened to her. She had only planned to go out for a short time, didn't even take any personal belongings, and many hours have passed since then. The duty officer writes down the caller's name and address. It is John Sablowski, 29, a resident of the nearby village of Farbus, while the missing person is his partner, 36-year-old Lawrence Mile, who lives with him. The duty officer reports that he is sending 2 gendarmes and asks John to wait for them at home. So soon the 2 officers show up at the couple's home in Farbus. John answers the questions in detail, and the gendarmes have the opportunity to gather accurate information about the whole case. So Lawrence, John's partner, went out for a walk with their female dog, Chloe, around 3 p.m. The woman was home alone at the time, but on her way out, she sent John a text message saying that she was just going for a walk with her dog. When the man returned home in the late afternoon, he found a note on the front door stating that someone had found their dog in a village about 7 kilometers away. The animal was wandering there, lost and scared. The lady who spotted the female dog noticed a key ring by her collar with the owner's address stamped on it. She managed to call John and Lawrence's neighbors, while the neighbors stuck this very card on the door of their house. John was very puzzled and, of course, immediately went to get the dog, but at that time he was still not so worried. He figured that Chloe had run away during the walk, and Lawrence was still looking for her. He only started to get nervous as time passed, and his partner was still not at home. In his conversation with the gendarmes, John states that he is sure that Lawrence could not have gone somewhere farther away to family or friends because, first of all, she would have notified him of such intentions, and secondly, she would have taken personal belongings with her. At the same time, the man stresses that there has been no quarrel between him and his partner while everything is going very well in their relationship. So surely something bad has happened to Lawrence, and action must be taken immediately. John is visibly panicked. The gendarmes try to calm him down. First of all, they check whether the woman really left home without the most necessary personal belongings. Confirmation of this fact is very important for their further work as they want to make sure that Lawrence did not leave her partner of her own free will. In fact, the woman's purse, which John hands them, contains keys, documents, and a phone. Since the man has absolutely no idea where his partner might have gone, the officers contact other people in the missing woman's immediate circle, including her husband, with whom Lawrence has long been separated. It is he who gives them information they find extremely disturbing. On that very day in the late afternoon, he and Lawrence had an appointment with a notary. It was an extremely important appointment for both of them. They were to finalize the sale of their shared house. In a conversation with the gendarmes, Lawrence's husband states that the relationship between him and his wife is very good. Yes, they are separated and their divorce is pending, but they get along without problems in all matters, including property. The man is very concerned. He stresses that he has no idea why his wife did not come to the meeting, especially since a large amount of money is involved. In his opinion, something must have happened. This opinion is also shared by Lawrence's parents. The mother says that her last conversation with her daughter took place the day before on the evening of November 27th. At the time, Lawrence was on her way to the doctor she had gone to for abdominal pain. She was later to call her mother to tell her what the doctor had said and also to go to the pharmacy. However, she did not hear from her daughter again, so her mother called her several times during the evening. Lawrence did not answer the phony or return calls, which is not like her at all. The gendarmes further investigate the case. It turns out that on the morning of the day of her disappearance, the young woman was apparently still feeling unwell, as is evident from the content of the messages she sent. In the morning, she texted a colleague at work to let her boss know that she wouldn't be coming to work. Not much later, she informed a friend with whom she was going to fitness that her stomach hurt and that she would not be showing up at the club that day. When asked about the course of the day, John confirms that his partner had a stomachache that morning and stayed in bed. For this reason, moreover, he wanted to prepare breakfast for her, so he went to get some bakery goods. But these purchases were prolonged because not all the bakeries were open that day. He also went to the pharmacy to get medicine for Lawrence. Finally, he returned, made breakfast, and then went to the fitness studio where he regularly trained. When he showed up at home after his workout, his partner was not there. All the people interviewed by the gendarmes rule out that Lawrence might want to commit suicide. The next day, nearly 100 officers of various services are involved in the search for the missing woman. The gendarmes conduct further intelligence on the missing woman and start asking her closer and further acquaintances about her as well. They all agree. Lawrence loves life. She is full of energy, passionate about sports. She is kind and cheerful. As for her professional life, she has worked at a health insurance company for about 10 years where she is widely liked and considered reliable and responsible. She has no conflicts with anyone. Friends know that her divorce is pending, and some also know the story of her marriage and subsequent relationship with John. Gendarmes thus learned that 10 years earlier in 1997, Lawrence married a bank clerk. The couple had no children. For the first few years, they lived in harmony, but over time, things stopped going well in their marriage. They increasingly thought about divorce. In May 2006, a year and a half ago, Lawrence met John Sobolewski at a fitness club. There was an immediate spark between them. It was love at first sight, which they both later told everyone around them. John, handsome, muscular, dressed in the most fashionable clothes and very confident, was always very successful with women. However, in conversations with friends, he always claimed that it was only in Lawrence that he found the love of his life. He often made her gifts ranging from exclusive suites to jewelry and attractive expensive trips. Friends of the couple emphasized that Lawrence was very much in love with him. She separated from her husband and moved out of their shared home. A year after she met John, she moved in with him in the apartment they rented together. The couple planned to marry. On November 30th, the arrest prosecutor's office officially launches an investigation into the abduction and deprivation of freedom of 36-year-old Lawrence Mihaly. John Sobolewski is doing everything to find his beloved. He designs a poster with her current photos and information about her disappearance and makes hundreds of copies of it. The poster hangs on almost every street corner, bus stop, or building in the nearby town of Lens. In the days that follow, John devotes all his free time to the search. He not only hangs the posters, but relentlessly drives around the city, inquiring everywhere about the missing woman. The man also makes contact with the media and gives an interview to a journalist of a national magazine. More days pass, but there is no trace of Lawrence. 6 days after the disappearance of the woman, the gendarmerie once again thoroughly analyzes the findings made. The investigators come to the conclusion that this total lack of traces begins to look strange. For as a rule, if someone suddenly disappears, some traces, however small, are found in the following days. The gendarmes begin to look more closely at all the details. One of the officers points out that the dog, found at such a considerable distance from the house, had a completely clean coat. It had been raining that day, and there was mud everywhere. So could it be that the animal had run 6 or 7 kilometers, and not a lump of mud or the smallest leaf had attached itself to its coat? As a precaution, investigators are consulting a veterinarian. He confirms that this is impossible in these weather conditions. The conclusion is simple. Someone transported the dog to the place where it was found, but for what purpose would a stranger, such as a kidnapper, do such a thing? Yet another detail strikes the gendarmes. On that day when Lawrence disappeared, John had replaced the lock on the back door of the house in the evening. When asked why, he explained that he was afraid of a burglary or robbery because the possible perpetrator might return after all. However, what investigators at the time considered a natural reaction to a sudden dramatic event now seems suspicious to them. So they focus on a new thread of John's possible involvement in the disappearance of his partner. They analyze the last text messages she sent, and after talking to their addressees again, they make an interesting finding. Both Lawrence's friend and her club mate find upon reflection that the style of the messages they received was not as usual, quite as if a different person had written them. Investigators are checking with the operator the area of the mast to which John and his partner's telephones logged on November 28th. Turns out that that day before noon, both phones moved around Lens in a sort of parallel manner. It appears that both phones were carried by one person, and that person could only be John. The man suddenly becomes the prime suspect. Investigators obtain permission to search at John and Lawrence's home. It turns out that in the couple's bed, on the bottom side of the mattress, there is a large dried bloodstain. It is human blood. After this finding, the investigators decide to spray the entire house with luminol. This is a substance that glows in the dark in places where there were previously traces of blood. This is visible even when the blood has been washed away. The analysis of blood traces is naturally helpful in reconstructing the course of events and makes it possible to determine how much blood the victim lost. After applying luminol to the first floor of John and Lawrence's house, the entire floor in all rooms lights up. Trace lines show that the lifeless body was dragged from the bedroom to the garage, and calculations of the amount of blood lost indicate that Lawrence is dead. Later that day, John is arrested. Investigators begin to examine the suspect more closely. A number of interesting facts come to light. First of all, it turns out that John is not very well liked among his acquaintances. Many of them consider him a braggart, narcissist, and conceited, while others consider him a lazy and slacker who has never held a place in any job for more than a month or two. They do not understand why such an intelligent and sensible woman as Lawrence got involved with him. After all, she is very attractive and could easily find a better partner. A former colleague calls him a liar and tells him that when John once worked as a salesman for a certain company, when he went into the field, he introduced himself to its customers as the company's president. He even made up a business card with this false information on it. Most of the people interviewed agree that John is endlessly in love with himself and puts enormous energy into confirming his special value to those around him. As one of his friends points out, this is an investment literally and figuratively. John lives a very high standard of living, which is completely out of line with his financial capabilities. He spends a lot of money at discos, buys expensive brand name clothes, drives a very expensive car. He relentlessly gets into affairs and sees women as a tool for him to assert himself. He cheats on each of his partners left and right, and Lawrence is, of course, no exception. The missing woman's mother stresses that she and her husband were very critical of their daughter's relationship, and they disliked John very much. They naturally did not tell their daughter everything they thought about him, as she was very much in love, and they did not want to upset her. John's ex-wife claims that he is prone to violence and unpredictable and completely unserious. She adds that they have a child together for whom he has not paid for a long time. As it seems, everything points to John as the perpetrator of Lawrence's disappearance, especially after the gendarmes' investigation may already conclusively exclude the missing woman's husband as a suspect. However, the arrested man does not admit guilt while hard evidence is lacking. Investigators try various strategies to get him to talk, but to no avail. It's the evening of December 4th when they decide on a foray. "We know Lawrence is dead, but perhaps it was an accident," says one of the interrogators unexpectedly. They suggest this explanation to the suspect because they are determined. First of all, they must find the body. John picks up on these words and finally admits that, yes, Lawrence is dead, but he is not to blame. He claims that when he came home, his partner was already dead. She was lying on the bed, her neck wrapped in wire. Having seen this, he assumed she had committed suicide. He was afraid to call the police because he thought he would be suspected of the crime. He recounts that he dragged the corpse to the garage and put it in the trunk, then drove it to the woods and buried it there. His further actions were just a consequence of the earlier ones. He drove the dog away to divert suspicion from himself. He staged a search for Lawrence for the same purpose. John insists, however, that his despair at losing his beloved was genuine. The interrogators pretend to believe him because at this point, the absolute priority is to find Lawrence's body. John explains where he buried the body and agrees to go with the gendarmes to lead them to the place. The officers don't want to waste a moment and, despite the very late hour, go with the arrestee to the forest, a few kilometers away from Farbus. At the indicated location, John leads the officers between the trees, about 10 meters into the woods. It's the middle of a December night, dark and cold. Several officers are digging up the ground with shovels. Soon, Lawrence's body lies next to her dug-up grave. The woman's legs are bound at the ankles, and her hands are bound at the joints. The neck shows a strangulation wound with something thin. Perhaps it was a wire. The forensic medical examiner's examination rules out suicide. Visible marks and injuries clearly indicate that the victim was first beaten and then strangled. However, there are no signs of a struggle on her body, which means that Lawrence did not defend herself. Perhaps she was under the influence of sleeping pills. Toxicological tests should be conducted. However, the results will have to wait. And now, while completing materials for the prosecution, investigators need to establish a motive for the crime. As they examine various pieces of information more closely, John's assertions about their relationship turn out to be completely untrue. One of the victim's friends says that Lawrence recently discovered that John had been spending money from her account for several months without her knowledge, using a payment card she had only made available to him for some time. All this time, John claimed to have a job. He even pretended to go to it as he left home every day. When all this came to light, Lawrence told him that this was clearly the end of their relationship and that she would move out immediately after selling the house. From another acquaintance, the gendarmes learned that a few days before Lawrence disappeared, she cried and complained about John. She said that John had huge debts dating back to even before their relationship. He had reportedly been counting on her to pay them off, but now that she had announced the breakup, it seems to have dawned on him that none of this would happen. The friend added that Lawrence was very much affected by this huge disappointment in John's person. Investigators are convinced that the man probably killed his partner in a fit of rage, but when the results of toxicology tests come in, they have to rule out this version. After all, there is a huge dose of sleeping pills in the deceased's blood. Lawrence was therefore unconscious before her death, which fully explains why she did not defend herself. Everything, therefore, turns out to be one big staging by John. In 2011, John Sablowski is sentenced to 30 years in prison. The appeals court upholds this sentence. A man discovers his bride of 3 months dead on their living room floor. Was it a robbery gone wrong, or something far more sinister? The story of Sherry Rasmussen's murder took 23 years to solve, despite her family's unwavering belief about the culprit. What detectives eventually unearthed was a heartbreaking narrative of passion, jealousy, and revenge. In 1986, Sherry Ray Rasmussen, a 29-year-old nurse, was living with her husband of 3 months, John Rutan, in a condominium in Van Nuys, Los Angeles. The couple had married in November 1985 and were enjoying the early days of their life together as newlyweds. John had been smitten with Sherry from the moment they met 2 years earlier. She was 2 years his senior but exuded confidence and clarity about her goals. Tall, athletic, and strikingly beautiful with high cheekbones and captivating eyes, Sherry also possessed intelligence and ambition. It was no surprise that John had fallen head over heels for her. Although her parents disagreed, Sherry thought John was a perfect match for her. He was handsome and smart and had just started a new job at an engineering company. She wasn't his only admirer either, which may have made her desire even greater. Sherry's parents, Nels and Loretta, were not that fond of John. They found him to be pleasant enough, but not a good match for their daughter. Nels was a dentist, and along with Loretta, they had their own dental practice. Despite their dislike of John, they still had a close relationship with Sherry, and she confided in them often. That all changed on the February 25, 1986. They received a call from John's father with news that was as unexpected as it was shocking. Their beautiful daughter, Sherry, was dead. February 24th, Monday. Sherry Rasmussen didn't feel like going to work that day. She thought about calling in sick. That wasn't typical of Sherry. At just 29 years old, she excelled in her chosen profession. Sherry was a director of nursing at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center in Los Angeles in the United States. She didn't just want to excel, though. She wanted to completely revolutionize the field of nursing. That's why she also enjoyed taking classes. But on that particular morning, the class she was due to take just didn't appeal to her, as she felt that it was a waste of time. Still undecided about what she planned to do that day, Sherry stayed in bed while her husband, John Rutan, went to work since Sherry wasn't sure if she would go to work and take the class. But John needed to go to work since he had just started a new job. He left at 7:20 a.m. Sherry was still in bed. John was at his desk before 8 a.m. On his way to work, he dropped off some laundry, and he called Sherry at home a while later to see how she was. There was no reply, so presuming she went to work, he called her office. Her secretary had not seen her, and he tried calling her another 3-4 times. John wasn't alarmed, as the secretary would not always see Sherry, as if she was taking a class. She didn't always call into the office first. When John finished work, He collected his laundry and some post and went home. Their garage door was up, which was unusual, and he noticed that Sherry's car was not in the garage. She must have gone out after all. He did notice there was some glass on the ground, though, so went on upstairs in the condo. Upstairs, the door to the living room was open, and it was then that he discovered the devastating scene. Sherry was on the living room floor, and she was dead. Sherry was on her back on the brown rug in their living room. She was in her pajamas and bathrobe, and her arms were up in the air and bent, and one leg was bent at the knee. Her face was badly beaten, bloody and swollen. John called 911. Nels and Loretta only found out about their daughter's death on the February 25th, but she had died the day before, 24th. They received a call from John's father with news that was as unexpected as it was shocking. Their beautiful daughter, Sherry, was dead. John didn't call them, and they wanted to know why. Why would a husband not notify their in-laws that their daughter had not just died, but had been brutally murdered? It would be a further 23 years before their suspicions were confirmed as to what happened to her. The crime scene led the detective to believe that Sherry's death was the result of a burglary. They believed that perhaps whoever broke in to steal some items were surprised that Sherry was home, and when she disturbed them, they killed her. This was in line with some other burglaries nearby. Some houses had been broken into, and a woman had been assaulted in one of the houses. 2 Latin men were alleged to have been involved, and the detective believed this was probably what had happened at John and Sherry's home. The detective questioned John, but not to a great extent. It was clear that the detective had made up his mind. This murder was the result of a burglary gone wrong. One of the speakers in the living room was on the floor beside Sherry. Their gray ceramic vase had been smashed and was also on the floor in pieces. A VCR and CD player had been stacked and left on the stairs, and there was a bloody smudge on top of the CD player. There were smears of blood on the walls and the front door also. Upstairs, the glass sliding door that led to the balcony was shattered. Sherry's body revealed what had happened to her. She had been shot 3 times in the chest. A blanket in the living room had a bullet hole in it, so it was believed that it had been used to disguise the sound of the gunshot. She also had significant damage to her right eye, and the detective believed she had been struck over the head with the vase. There was a bite mark on her inner forearm. At 2 a.m., criminalist Lloyd Mahaney from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office arrived on the scene. He first looked for any trace evidence on Sherry's body, but found nothing stood out. No hair, fibers, or fluids. He then collected some swabs to rule in or out that a sexual assault may have taken place. Sherry was not sexually assaulted. Next, Mahaney swabbed the bite mark on Sherry's arm. He placed the swab in a 6-inch tube with a rubber stopper and labeled it with his initials and the coroner's case number. As per procedure, he then placed the tube inside a 5x7 evidence envelope with Sherry's name, description of contents, and where they were collected. All of Mahaney's evidence was booked into evidence at 10:25 a.m. on February 25, 1986. Sherry's autopsy was conducted 2 days after her murder. The coroner was able to recover 3 bullets, 1 under the skin in her back and 2 from clothing under her back, 2 shots to her upper chest area and the 3rd to her upper abdomen. One of the 3 shots fired had a direct contact wound to her chest. All 3 shots were considered fatal. Sherry Rasmussen had numerous trauma points on her face. One was consistent with a blow from the muzzle of a gun. She had several lacerations around her right eye, left cheek, and the left side of her throat. There were also marks on her wrists that may indicate that she had been or was attempted to be restrained at some point. This injury was consistent with being tied up with a rope or cord. The detective told John that day Sherry's death was the result of a burglary, and John agreed. Through canvassing the neighborhood after Sherry's murder, detectives found a housekeeper next door who heard what sounded like a domestic situation in Sherry's unit. She did not call the police as she had not heard any gunshots. Sherry's murder would be one of 831 murders to occur in Los Angeles in 1986. Police found Sherry's BMW 2 miles from the couple's home 10 days after her murder. The keys were still in the ignition. The only other item besides Sherry's car that was stolen was the couple's marriage license. John was quickly cleared as a suspect. He had a solid alibi and was devastated by his wife's murder. John and Sherry had met a year and a half prior and had instantly fallen in love. They were both up and coming professionals and were still in the newlywed phase of their life together. John could not think of anyone who would want to hurt Sherry, but some of Sherry's friends and family did. Sherry's father mentioned his daughter's issues with Lady Cop to police, and a note was made. Sherry had told Nels that weeks before their wedding, a woman showed up at their home. She wanted John to wax her water skis and was an old friend of his. Sherry believed this was just an excuse for her to call into the house to check up on and see John. Sherry asked John not to wax the skis, but John did so anyway, and the woman collected the skis from their home. When she collected the skis, she was wearing her police uniform and told Sherry she was on a break. Nels gave this information to the detective, but it was not followed up. Detective Mayer, however, was sticking to his theory that Sherry's murder was a result of a botched robbery. To bolster his theory, there was a break-in where 2 Hispanic males had assaulted a female in her home in the same neighborhood not 10 days later. Nels, however, wasn't buying it. Though the bite mark proved to be unusual, the case went cold as no suspect was ever identified. Los Angeles Police Department was too overwhelmed with the growing crack epidemic and related gang violence to dedicate the time needed for the investigation. But Sherry's father never believed that his daughter would not have been able to defend herself against a random burglar. The Rasmussens were frustrated by the lack of progress on Sherry's case. Nels didn't feel that his information was being taken seriously, or worse yet, outright ignored because he was pointing a finger at one of their own. 8 months after Sherry's murder, the Rasmussens offered a $10,000 reward for any information regarding who murdered their daughter. In 1988, Nels wrote a letter to the chief of police, Daryl Gates, asking him to look into John's ex-girlfriend to rule her in or out as a suspect. He never got a reply. Nels didn't give up and continued to call Detective Mayer about John's ex. He was told that he watched too much television. Sherry's case went cold. Every now and again, the case would be opened and looked at, but often just put away again. That was until 2005 when it was noticed that a swab had been taken from the bite on Sherry's forearm, but wasn't in the evidence file. A thorough search revealed that it was still in the coroner's freezer. It had been there for 18 years, and it was confirmed that the bite mark was made by a woman. This meant that the detective's theory that 2 Latin men were involved didn't make sense. However, the file went back into storage as there was nothing about any woman on the file. All of the information that Nels had provided was not on the file. A few years later, a new set of detectives looked at the case again with a fresh and new approach. They didn't agree with the original detective. They believed that on that day, February 24th, somebody entered the home through the front door. The alarm was off and the door was open, so it would not have caused any alarm or noise. They then went upstairs and fired 2 shots. Both missed and hit the door leading to the balcony, which is what caused the glass to shatter. They then believed that Sherry ran upstairs. They believed she was trying to reach the panic button, but the intruder caught her before she could do so, and a fight took place. Sherry managed to get the intruder into a headlock, but the intruder bit her arm, which caused her to release her. The intruder then smashed the vase over Sherry's head and shot her in the chest. The intruder then got the blanket and shot twice more. The blood that was on the CD player was Sherry's blood, and the detectives believed that got there after the murder. If that was the case, it seemed that the scene was staged to look like a burglary. If it wasn't a burglary, what was the motive? Who would want Sherry dead? Detectives eventually found Stephanie Lazarus' name in the notes from the original investigation and decided to pursue the lead. They collected DNA from a coffee cup Lazarus threw away while off-duty and were able to match it to the sample taken from the bite mark. Who was Stephanie Lazarus? John met Stephanie when they were both attending UCLA and living in the same dorm on campus. The two hung out with a group of friends and casually hooked up from time to time, with their relationship turning intimate after they graduated. The new detectives working on the case wanted to know who Stephanie Lazarus was. As it turned out, PO stood for police officer, so they were able to search her name and find her details in the police system. Stephanie Lazarus was a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department. With Stephanie Lazarus on the suspect list, they needed to maintain secrecy lest they damage an exemplary officer's records. Stephanie Lazarus had spent the last 23 years working her way up the ladder at the LAPD to detective. She had an unblemished record with no complaints or citations for misconduct. She was awarded Officer of the Year twice. Currently, she was working in the high-profile art theft division. Lazarus was also married to a detective that worked in the same division. Detectives didn't want her to be made aware of their investigation, so they worked the evidence. Soon, they were able to eliminate 3 of the 5 suspects. That left Lazarus and a nurse that Sherry Rasmussen had worked with. Detectives surreptitiously worked to obtain the nurse's DNA, and by mid-April, it came back negative. Now they were down to 1. Detectives looked at the connection between Lazarus and Sherry, which was John Rutan. John and Lazarus met at UCLA and casually dated until June 1984. John met Sherry in June 1984. The couple got engaged in May 1985. Lazarus learned of John's engagement in June 1985. This effectively put an end to their casual hookups. Or did it? John admitted to detectives in a 2009 interview that in June, when Lazarus found out that he was going to get married, she contacted him extremely upset asking to meet. John went over to Lazarus's place to talk and tell her that he was set on marrying Sherry. Lazarus begged him to reconsider, telling him she loved him and wanted a committed relationship with him. The two ended up having sex. It was after this meetup that Lazarus confronted Sherry at her place of work. Detectives discovered a second time that Lazarus confronted Sherry Rasmussen. This information came from Sherry's father, who reported that Sherry told him that one day she found Lazarus standing in her living room in a full police uniform. Sherry had no idea how she had gotten in. This resulted in another verbal altercation that left Sherry scared. Next, detectives needed to figure out if Lazarus was on duty the day of the murder. They figured if she did carry out the crime, it would have to be a day she had off. Lazarus did not work the day of the murder. Knowing that a .38 caliber gun was used, did Lazarus own a .38? This would have been either a backup or off-duty gun. In 1986, LAPD officers were required to use Federal .38J plus P ammunition in their weapons. This was the type of ammunition that was used to kill Sherry Rasmussen. On April 30th, 2009, detectives entered Lazarus' name into the California Gun Registry. Stephanie Lazarus had reported on March 9, 1986, her registered .38 had been stolen. This was 13 days after Sherry's murder. According to the stolen gun report, Lazarus had reported the theft to the Santa Monica Police Department. She claimed that her car had been broken into and had been parked near the Santa Monica Pier. The thief had broken in on the driver's side door, punching in the lock and stealing her blue gym bag. In that gym bag were clothes, cassette tapes, and her Smith & Wesson .38 revolver. Lazarus made sure to identify herself as a police officer when she was making the report. The two departments, Van Nuys and Santa Monica, never put it together, and Lazarus bought a different model backup piece on March 19, 1986. The Van Nuys detectives knew that they needed to bring in those higher in command, as it was looking more and more as if one of their own had murdered Sherry Rasmussen. The chief of the Valley Bureau was informed of the investigation and allowed Van Nuys to run with it until a DNA sample could be obtained. If it turned out that the sample matched, then the case would go to the Robbery Homicide Division of the LAPD, as they were responsible for handling high-profile cases. On May 27, 2009, plainclothes detectives surveilled Lazarus as she was running errands. After observing Lazarus and her daughter eating lunch, they collected a discarded cup and straw from the trash. On May 29th, a confirmed match was made. Lazarus' saliva matched the saliva from the bite mark left on Sherry's arm. Sherry's case was transferred to Robbery Homicide, and 2 new detectives, Stearns and Jaramillo, were brought up to speed. Afterward, they met with the prosecutor who would be assigned to prosecute Stephanie Lazarus. There were constant concerns about the case leaking out. So for the next week, detectives worked out of the prosecutor's office instead of right across the hall from the Art Theft Division in the Parker Center. 2 of the detectives from Van Nuys traveled to Arizona to talk with Sherry's family. They wanted to get on the record statements from them. Not being able to tell Sherry's family that they were close to making an arrest, they asked the family to be patient with them a little longer. They had waited over 23 years. Could they wait for a little more? Detectives next planned how they were going to interview and ultimately arrest Lazarus without putting anyone in jeopardy, as she had a firearm. It was decided that they would do the interview in the jail at the Parker Center, as cops had to turn over their guns before entering. Under the guise of wanting Lazarus' assistance with the case, detectives met with her on the morning of Friday, June 5th. After Lazarus arrived in the interrogation room, detectives started talking to her about a case involving an ex-boyfriend and the murder of his wife. For more than an hour, detectives questioned Lazarus on her relationship with John Rutten and if she had ever met Sherry Rasmussen and if the two ever had an argument. At first, Lazarus claimed that she couldn't even remember John's wife's name or if they had ever met, but eventually she said she thought they had, but they never had been in an argument. She told the detectives that John was a close friend, and they dated casually, but was evasive when it came to how long or when she had last spoken to him. The interview ended when detectives asked if Lazarus was willing to give a DNA sample, and she told them she wanted a lawyer. Once Lazarus was in the hallway, she was placed under arrest by robbery-homicide detectives and put in handcuffs. In 2010, Stephanie stood trial for the murder of Sherry. She pleaded not guilty. In March 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The motive was clear. Stephanie had been so infatuated with John that she made sure that if she couldn't have him, Sherry wouldn't either. Detectives looked into the possibility that John was involved in the murder. In the years that Sherry's case lay cold and closed, Stephanie married, adopted a daughter, and became a detective. However, in 2012, she finally received some punishment and was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Thanks for diving into another mystery with us. If you enjoyed unraveling the clues and chasing the truth, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling cases and deep dives into the unknown.